Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the IWM. My name is Kate Younger. I'm a permanent fellow here at the IWM, and I oversee our Documenting Ukraine and our Ukraine and European Dialogue programs. I'm really glad you're with us this evening as we embark on another year of events here in our library and elsewhere throughout the city, such as the Vienna Humanities Festival at the end of this month. So 2 packed days of conversations with interesting people, so we hope you'll join us for that. But tonight, it is my real pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Sasha Dovzhyk. Sasha is a writer, literary scholar, and curator originally from Zaporizhzhia. She holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Birkbeck University of London and is a special projects curator at Ukrainian Institute London. Since Russia's full-scale invasion, she has been splitting her time between London and Ukraine, where she's involved in a number of humanitarian initiatives, and she's currently a Ukrainian European Dialogue Fellow here at the IWM, thanks to the support of the city of Vienna. And previously, we were very honored to support her work with Documenting Ukraine. Sasha's writing has appeared in publications including The Guardian, Los Angeles Review of Books, and CNN Opinion. And she's also, I would like to especially mention, the editor of the really wonderful London Ukrainian Review, whose latest really beautiful issue was dedicated to the memory of the writer Victoria Melina, our colleague and friend who was killed by a Russian missile in June. Tonight, we have the really great privilege of hearing excerpts of Sasha's work in progress, Once Upon a Time in Ukraine, Tales of Full-Scale Resistance, and to talk and think together about testimonies, storytelling, and how the past and future come together in the present. We'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion after we hear from Sasha, and then we will also be able to continue that discussion over wine and cheese in the IWM cafeteria afterwards. So Sasha, I'm so glad that you're here with us this evening, and I'm really looking forward to hearing. I wanted to ask you a couple questions to start off our discussion tonight. So I think, you and so many Ukrainians have worn so many hats since the start of the full-scale Russian invasion. Writer, editor, curator, fixer, humanitarian aid worker, right? But I think one thing that really kind of underpins everything you've been doing is trying to understand, record, honor, and convey people's experiences of the war, to place them in the longer context of Ukrainian history as well. This is something that we here at the IWM are trying to do as well with Documenting Ukraine, right? This is, in some senses, people have been talking about it in quotes sometimes as the most documented war, which is something that we can kind of get into what that actually means. And I think there's many purposes for which a chronicle of what's happening is needed, right? This can be legal justice, it can be memory, it can be reconstruction, all of those are reasons. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, how do you think of your work as a sort of gatherer of testimony, as a documentarian, a storyteller?
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you everyone for coming here tonight. It's just a huge privilege for me to be here, and I'm so grateful for all the support to IWM. All my work would be really impossible. It's not just empty words without this support. Well, the first urge to collect these testimonies, I think, was existential, as we see our culture being threatened with annihilation. What we're trying to do is to preserve as much as we can, and in all the ways possible. And I was just coming across stories which I would not think were that were incredible in different ways. They were unbelievable, the stories of resistance. And being someone who is at this intersection of English-speaking and Ukrainian audiences, who has been in various international contexts for some time, I thought that it was my privilege, really, and my duty to try to translate these Ukrainian stories into a global language, the English language. Recently, the metaphor that comes to mind more and more often is that of Scheherazade from 1001 Night. We probably all remember her colorful stories, but we sometimes forget that the reason she's telling us all these stories is that she has been threatened with death. As long as she stops speaking, the Sultan, who is her primary audience, will execute her. So we are all, in a way, in this position now. We are telling these stories of Ukrainian resistance, and we are trying to pass them on. And as long as we speak, we survive, and our culture prevails.
This is something actually that makes me think so much of Vika, actually, because one of the things that Victoria Amelina did since the start of the full-scale invasion is retrain as a war crimes documenter, and she was the one who found the diary, the buried diary of the children's writer Volodymyr Vakulenko in Izium when it was liberated. And that's something that I remember her saying very clearly, is that as you know, as long as a writer's words are there, as long as their stories are told, then they are still alive in a certain way. And I think that is something that we're seeing over and over again. And you know, this also is so rooted in Ukrainian history as well. This sort of executed Renaissance being the kind of most common reference point. So the generation of writers in the early 1930s who were executed by the Soviet regime. But I think there's also a longer tradition in Ukrainian literature, right, of this sort of struggle of resistance. And this is something you have worked with a lot. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think about especially someone like Lesya Ukrainka, who really fits into the...
Indeed. Well, it's probably one of the motives behind the Russian full-scale invasion, is to implant this view that Ukraine is a no place, that it's this desert of meaning. This is something that they are trying to achieve with this all-out war. And our duty against this invasion is to say that actually it's not only a war-torn country, it's a country with a great cultural tradition, it's a country with rich history, and it's a country with a rich history of resistance. And it is because of this rich history of resistance that we are able to withstand this brutal invasion. And we've been turning to our heroes, Ukrainian heroes of this tradition of resistance, from Taras Shevchenko, who is sometimes hailed as the father of the nation, the great Ukrainian poet, to, of course, Lesya Ukrainka, who is a canonical Ukrainian writer situated at the very top of the national canon, which is a bit unusual for a European literature to have a woman at the top of the national canon, and this is true of Ukraine. Lesya Ukrainka has been significant in many ways, and recently we've been rediscovering her writing about the Russian Empire. She was not of a very high opinion of that, and we've been rediscovering her thinking about her own personal struggle with the disease. She's been ill with tuberculosis of the bones, which she called her 30 years war. This was, of course, a debilitating illness, but also something which allowed her to experience things not too many of her contemporaries experienced. She went abroad a lot in search of good climates, in search of medical cures. She was a great traveler. And she also thought a lot about overcoming physical suffering. She had this transcendental strain in her writing. And with her writing, she proved that one's mind and one's soul and one's aspiration was so much stronger than one's body. And it is this particular strain of her writing that is becoming more and more familiar to many Ukrainians these days. We've been discovering her poems on the doors of bomb shelters, and her famous line, "In order not to cry, I laughed." We keep telling it to each other every day in order to just cope with this experience. In order not to cry, we laugh. And every now and so often there emerge pictures with Lesya Ukrainka's quotes tattooed on the bodies of Ukrainian defenders. And now that I discover her volumes not only in wonderful European and Ukrainian libraries, but also, for example, in the half-destroyed library of Slovyansk, where there are no more readers to engage with these books, I understand the value of her words, the symbolic significance of her words, and they're becoming only stronger.
I mean, I think that one of the things that gets at is, in a sense, you know, Scheherazade telling stories. I like this metaphor very much, and I think it's in order to sustain herself and keep herself alive. And I think, you know, in a sense, there's telling yourselves, right? Ukrainians telling each other's stories, that's also sustaining, but then also telling them to the outside world, as you're kind of talking about this intersection by which, right, you kind of maintain the interest and the engagement and the support. How do you think about the stories that are kind of tailored to these audiences? You know, your experiences working as a fixer as well have, I'm sure, showed you many things in this regard. I'm very interested to hear how you think about that.
Well, yes, during the first weeks, months of the full-scale invasion, I was a fixer for foreign media covering the war in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And at that point on the timeline, it was an urge to immediately influence the situation, to tell the story which will open everybody's eyes to what was happening. Just to document all Russian atrocities, to make them clear to the outside world, so that to call the outside world to action, so that the outside world would realize that the action has to be taken immediately. That has not quite materialized, and I think now I'm starting to think about this documenting process as a more long-standing journey, as an attempt to give a more long-lasting legacy to all these stories, so that they do not disappear into the black hole of the internet, so that they don't just flash as breaking news items, but become part of libraries like this, and people can turn back to them after our victory and draw inspiration, hopefully, from our resistance.
Yeah, I think this is something we think about a lot with documenting Ukraine as well, is the sort of multiple timelines along which you have to tell these stories, and in which these stories are reinterpreted and re-understood in many different ways. You know, historians will get some, I mean, we were just talking about what are historians going to get out of all of this, right? And that's something very different than a sort of news reading public is going to want to get out of it. And I think you're so right that one of the sort of values and things that we can do to honor people is to make sure that those stories aren't lost. And there's so many different ways of doing that. And that gets me back to kind of the sort of choice of how we tell those stories, yeah? Because there's a sort of, this was one of the very interesting things. In June, we got together a big group of people working in documentation in different ways. It was about 150 people in Lviv. And together we were sort of reflecting on, is there something that we all have in common, regardless of how we're approaching this? Lawyers, journalists, historians, civil society activists, like what are the kind of common principles? And there was this sort of sense that actually it's hard to identify those, because lawyers, and if they're collecting evidence for a specific court proceeding, have very specific procedures they need to follow, evidentiary chains and all of that, right? And that's very different. And so how can you then build that out and bring that together? And I think one of the things that I find really important is not sort of placing a value hierarchy on particular ways of telling. And I think the sort of human stories, and this is something that I really liked that you were writing, that it's also not specific people are worthy of having their stories told, but you wrote, all of us are legitimate narrators of contemporary Ukrainian history, right? Because it's not just one story, it's an abundance of stories. So how do you think about that as well in a nation of, you know, over 40 million people? What stories are being told?
Yeah, it's a good question of selection and of choice, and I don't have a clear answer to that question. I'm just being driven by the material. At first, when I applied for the Documenting Ukraine grant, I had one thing in mind. I thought that I would go back to my native region of Zaporizhia, and I would write about local identity, southeastern Ukrainian identity, and how it was changing. That did not happen. I have not been in Zaporizhia since the end of 2021, but I've been to many places in eastern Ukraine and obviously the Kyiv region. And I allowed myself not to impose my own vision of how this documenting should take place on the material and just be led by the stories that I come across. And this shaped into this book project that I'm working on right now, which is partly creative nonfiction essays, which reflect on the role of literature, language, history in the current Ukrainian struggle. And partly it's something that I call stylized fairy tales, but they are not actually fairy tales, they are testimonies with stylized elements. I think that it's not only true for me, it's true for many people. When we encounter the horror of current Ukrainian experience, in order to withstand it, we sometimes look for universal dimension of the story. We want to read it as a universal, eternal story, not just the horrific experience we are being pulled through. And once you start looking for these universal aspects, folklore is the immediate answer. You enter the territory of folklore and of myth. And it also, I think, is a valid way of trying to present and preserve these stories of Ukrainian resistance, because being a Ukrainian, I believe that some things are really black and white. And this is what fairy tales, for example, allow us to experience. There is good and there is evil, and there is a clear arc of how the story develops. There is probably a way of explaining how I came across this frame. At the start of 2022, this is a prehistoric time. You remember there were Russian troops amassing at the Ukrainian border. I was living in London at that point, so I packed my bags and went to Ukraine to be on the ground. And I made a stop in Dublin on my way to Ukraine. And there in Dublin, I saw a sculpture called David and Goliath. David and Goliath. It was a sculpture of a pink sculpture of a boy wearing shorts and baseball cap and sneakers, and he was trumping the head of really this monstrous mythological head of Goliath. And it was this universal story of a sly street kid defeating a monster. And even before the full-scale invasion, it was quite clear that we were at the beginning of this story. We were about to witness it unfold. And I kept this image in mind, and of course, I'm not the only one. This metaphor has been recirculated in the circles of Ukrainians and Ukrainian allies. And I think it's a helpful metaphor to think about our experience. Sometimes things are black and white. Sometimes we should turn away from moral relativism and attempts to overcomplicate a very clear story. We currently witness a really black and white moment in history, and our actions will define the rest of this life, of our lives, and the course of this century.
I think that moral clarity is something that a lot of us almost found uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. That a lot of people have found uncomfortable, this sort of sense of we're not accustomed mm-hmm. to being able to say clearly that this is not an ambiguous situation. And a lot of people have struggled with that. And then turning to the tropes of something like fairy tales, of these sort of classic stories that we know, can be a way to help process this. But I also know that there have been sort of almost folkloric or fairy tale elements that have come up over and over as you've been gathering stories, gathering testimonies, and that actually brings me to ask you if you would be willing to read.
I would be delighted, thank you. Okay, this is my microphone. Let's not try to throw it out. Let us follow a little Red Riding Hood into the woods of northern Ukraine. In the late spring of 2022, Kyiv was coming back to life after rebuking Russia's near siege. Things were changing. Chestnut trees were shedding flowers. Streets were filling up with people. Those who'd fled were coming back. Those who'd stayed were coming out of dungeons. And everyone was learning not to be afraid of thunder. Sometimes a storm is just a storm and not the enemy's bombardment. As in Ovid's tale of metamorphosis, bodies were changing to different forms, and I didn't want to be a stranger to the theme of transformation. I went out to crop my waist-long hair. In Kiev's old town, I chanced upon a new hair salon. There, I met a girl with scissors who was to change my vision of this war. Her name was Milana. She was translucent, fragile. A porcelain ballerina in a grandmother's sideboard, which many a Soviet kid eyed with longing, but was forbidden to touch. I was not surprised to learn that Milana's grandmother had made her train as a belly dancer for a decade. We were alone in the salon. The monochrome room, all shine and mirrors, provided a minimalist frame for Milana's pastel looks. Lulled by beauty rituals, I lazily answered her questions, mostly about my hair, occasionally about my life. I was working with foreign journalists, helping to fix their encounters with Ukrainian reality. I was a fixer too, in Bucha, smiled Milana. I felt dizzy. The ballerina behind my back was morphing into a genocide survivor. Want to tell me more? In March 2022, Milana, her mother and grandmother spent 6 days in the basement of their house in Bucha, a green town in Kiev suburbia that has since become synonymous with Russian war crimes. A friend knew I was there and gave my contact details to a journalist. We spoke on Zoom. Luckily, there was a smart blazer in the basement. She chuckled confidentially. The Los Angeles guy was surprised I looked presentable. We Ukrainians can make an effort. She was so piercingly young. Did you hear the Russians while you were hiding? I sought to meet her eyes in the mirror, but she busied herself with my curls. Yes, we heard their steps and their voices, their threats too. We knew they must not find us. They would have raped us. Instead of raped, she used a euphemism which my memory crossed out. Rape was too blunt a word for a salon where women like me came for a spell to be transfigured, made beautiful, and free. The girl with flaxen-colored hair and her mother were in the capital when the enemy's troops invaded the country from the north, east, and south. The grandmother was stuck in her house a short ride away, a ride that led the girl and her mother straight into the open jaws of the enemy. We drove to Bucha to pick up grandmother and the wolves. Catching my gaze in the mirror, Milana hurried to clarify shepherd dogs. We had 4 shepherd dogs. The first wolf's name was Gabriel. Archangel Gabriel is used by God to deliver revelations to people on earth. The revelations brought by the commuter's route from Kiev to Bucha involved cars riddled with bullets, bodies stretched in front of them, families shot dead by the road. The Russian army met Ukrainian civilians who tried to flee the occupation with gunfire. Some wounded died of blood loss along the wayside. Some bodies were removed from the highway only in April, after the liberation of the Kiev region. Some vehicles, burned, perforated, and maimed, still wore the traces of the word children inscribed on hoods and doors, a kind of broken armor that failed to protect them. When we turned to drive back to Kiev, the Russians started shooting at the cars in front of us. They shot at the column from tanks. The women drove back to their house in Bucha. For 6 days, they hid in the basement listening to the town explode street by street. During 33 days of Bucha's occupation by the Russians, 3,846 residential buildings were destroyed. Yet those explosions were not half as loud as the steps of the Russian army boots above the women's heads. The second wolf's name was Bandera. Stepan Bandera, the founder of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, became the boogeyman of choice of Soviet and later Russian propaganda. The Kremlin employed the myth of Bandera and the Banderites to justify the denazification of Ukraine by means of wiping it off the face of the earth. For many Ukrainians, after the Russian invasion of 2014, the sanitized image of Bandera became a symbol of the fight against Moscow. To signal their attitude to Russia's neocolonial ambitions, a Russian-speaking family in Ukraine had named its dog after the Ukrainian nationalist. And Bandera would lead the family away from the Russian fascists, predators sniffing their house for a trace of living things to be defiled. "We must leave tonight," the mother said. "If we don't, either the Russians find us or a missile." And the mother was right. The day after they left, their house was turned to ashes by a Russian missile. As I was listening to Milana's story, the Disney princess in the mirror faded. Hers was not a story prettified for seamless mass consumption. Each turn of the plot exposed much darker roots, reaching into the far away and down below of the accrued wisdom of the past. In her short history of fairy tale, Marina Warner notes that fairies are sometimes called folk tales for their origins in the oral tradition, in the secrets passed down the generations as a promise of escape from subjugation and injustice. From Plato onwards, this ancient knowledge was dismissed as old wives' tales. And folklore spoke all too often of women's experience, the experience of overcoming and exceeding power through wit and courage. Milana's was not a story of a maiden in distress or of a porcelain ballerina thrown into a fire, but of a little Red Riding Hood. Only in Milana's tale, the girl conspired with the wolves to deceive the savage hunters. At the darkest hour, the women, guided by the wolves, emerged from the belly of the house. Smelling the enemy, the German shepherds led Milana, her mother and grandmother away from danger. They turned into one body, a new breed begotten by the war, canine senses around the humans' fiery hearts. While they were walking down the streets of Bucha, they heard the cries of people being tortured, the cries of people being raped. "I dream of these cries sometimes," Milana said flatly. Fairy tales are one-dimensional, depthless, abstract, and sparse, explains Marina Warner. Their characteristic manner is matter-of-fact. Describing a wolf devouring a young girl arouses no cry of protest or horror from the teller. This is as it happened. The tale is as it is, no more, no less. According to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, the Russian army committed 9,000 war crimes in Bucha, including sexual violence, torture, and mass killings of civilians. More than 1,400 Ukrainian civilians were murdered by the Russians in that town alone. Milana's cousin was among the murdered. Her best friend from school among the murdered and the raped. Like Milana, the women were barely 20. The third wolf's name was Lucifer. From the Latin light and bearing, Lucifer was the name Romans gave to the morning star, planet Venus at dawn. For good Christians, the name evoked the angel hurled from heaven down to hell. Out of the living hell and through the woods, the four wolves led the girl, the mother, and the grandmother to safety. The woods were mined, and the sky was lit with rockets. And yet at dawn, the women and the beasts emerged from the forest in front of the position of the Ukrainian armed forces, unharmed. The eldest wolf's name was Zirochka. It means little star in Ukrainian. Upon hearing her childish name, I finally cried. Milana started drying my wonderful curls. And I hope you are ready for the moral. Fairy tales are not defeatist. They embody a determination to bind the free-floating evil of the world, to pursue a happy ending, whatever the odds. The fairy tales coming from Ukraine today are dark, but brimming with defiance. They reverse the currents of power and reshape the world as we knew it. They are driven by faith that nothing but the restoration of justice will suffice. From the human rights lawyer and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Alexander Matvichuk to hundreds of war crimes investigators on the ground, Ukrainians reject the system in which Russian soldiers invade a country, leave mass graves behind, and walk the earth unpunished. Amidst assurances that nothing of the sort has ever been achieved, Ukrainians vouch to pursue justice for every victim of every war crime committed by the Russians. Compromise with evil has not yet led a single story to a happy ending. Ukrainians insist that a monster who vouched to eat them alive, who's already devoured the ones they loved and set their house on fire, must be killed. The monster's bones will be dust, his memory a curse. Ukrainians insist that nothing but the end of Russia as we know it will ensure lasting peace. And while the world is mesmerized by the monstrosity, this story's cunning heroine has no option but to cease to be afraid. The world needs to start placing its faith in those who won't surrender to the power of the might. Thank you.
Sasha, I find this just incredibly powerful, so thank you for sharing it with us. You know, and I think one of the things that it really brought home to me as I was listening to you is the way in which finding different ways to tell stories is one way to make them still have power, even after over 18 months of full-scale war and after a decade of war in Ukraine. And I think this is something that is actually very much in Ukrainian discourse right now. I was thinking about something we were talking about earlier today, which is the film 20 Days in Mariupol by the two AP photographers who were there and were chronicling what was happening. And there's this sort of experience people are having now of watching it and almost feeling that so much time has passed that it feels like it has faded in a sense. And the horrors are returning in some ways, but also feel very distant and all of that. And I wonder how time is playing into things here, right? We're now at a place where, you know, there's more and more talk of it's going to be a long war and all of this, right? So how are you thinking about time and storytelling and their relationship?
Thank you. It's a very good question. For many people, the war has been over already. It's done and dusted. There are some people fighting somewhere on the eastern edge of Europe. And the news have stopped being shocking. And the breaking news really disappear from our timelines as soon as we turn away. And we're really under huge pressure to find new ways to turn the world's attention to what's going on in Ukraine. Mstislav Chernov's film is one way, and I hope that it's screening around the world, and I know it will be screened here in Vienna, and I encourage all of you to watch it. I haven't watched it myself. I'm sort of bracing myself to encounter this documentary, but I think we need it. We need it as an incentive to take action, because the longer this war lasts, the more Ukrainians lose the only resource which is not renewable, and that is the human resource. We can't, and by we I mean not Ukrainians, I mean us, Europe, the world. We can't afford to lose this resource. We can't delay action. We must act now, and we must use whatever instruments we have to try and stop it sooner rather than later. I have absolutely no doubt that Ukraine will win this war, but the price that we are paying every day is unbearable, and it weighs really, really very much on all of us.
You know, I mean, it does weigh immensely. And one of the ways, and telling ourselves stories, right, is one of the ways through that. to think, and I think one of the things that your project is doing, and I love this about it, is kind of making explicit that we are telling stories, right? Because I think, in a sense, everyone who is talking about what is happening is telling stories. We don't necessarily think of military analysts as telling stories. We don't think necessarily of policy people as doing that, but they are, in a sense. They're looking at what's out there, and they're finding a narrative and building a narrative out of that. And in some sense, that is its own form of storytelling, right? Can you tell a story about how the counteroffensive is moving too slowly and is a failure? Or can you tell a different story? And this is something Tim Snyder has pointed to over and over again, is we're just looking in the wrong place to miss the story. And I think that that's something that I really love about what you're doing here. And I kind of, one of my kind of things that I was thinking here is it almost takes a literary scholar to be able to do this, right? To bring these analytical tools in. And so how are you thinking about wedding these parts of your lives and bringing it together?
Yeah, it's... the immediate response to a full-scale invasion, I will go and train as a paramedic and go to the front line. But yeah, I'm not saying this will not happen, we'll see. But for now, we are using the skills that we have at this point. And once we see that those skills are not doing what we want them to do and not achieving what we want them to achieve, probably it's the right time to take the next step and try to configure how else we can bring Ukrainian victory closer. But yes, reading all these books have not been in vain, I hope. I've been thinking a lot about the tradition of revisionist feminist myth-making, which was a trend in the so-called second wave feminist writing of the 20th century, and what Lesya Ukrainka did at the beginning of the 20th century. So the chronology here is sort of very vague. Women like Sylvia Plath and Adrienne Rich were taking old myths and old frames and fueling it with a new meaning, and this new meaning was subversive. Lesya Ukrainka was one of those revisionists, feminist revisionist myth maker who retold European myths from an anti-imperialist and feminist point of view. So in her, we of course find the myth of Cassandra, the story of the Trojan War, the foundational myth of European cultural tradition, told from the perspective of a woman, of a prophetess who is being silenced in the patriarchal society. And it's told in such a fresh way, which I think is still relevant today, the question of knowledge, power, and who is believed and who is allowed to speak. Yeah. Lesya Ukrainka ventured into that territory in 1908. What were you asking me? I start talking about Lesya Ukrainka and I never stop.
No, but this sort of myth-making, right, and all of this, and I think that makes a ton of sense to me. I think one of the other things, and we've been talking about this as well, is that the Ukrainian Institute London is really thinking about Ukraine global, right, and kind of broadening our view. And this is something we're hearing increasingly, and I think, for example, the Ukrainian state has really realized that this is something important to do, is to kind of have this direct connection to the world outside of Europe. And one of the things that I was really struck by was talking to Natalia Humaniuk, who's been bringing groups of journalists from Africa, from Latin America to Ukraine. And one of the things she was saying is, you have to kind of really think about what aspects and commonalities and shared stories really then begin to speak to people, right? And if you want to talk about food security, right, that's something that speaks in a different way than just talking about this mission of kind of saving Europe or whatever, right? And kind of finding those other ways in and those other commonalities. And how are you thinking about that as well, about the sort of universality here and finding these different stories that can be told?
Funny enough, I've been writing about food for the past 2 or 3 weeks because, Ukraine for a long time was considered this breadbasket of the world because of the amazing black soil fields of Ukraine, which have 25% of the continent's black soil, which is incredibly fertile. And of course, this These fields are being set on fire and they're being mined and they're being drowned by Russians for a reason. And it's this use of food as a weapon, as an instrument of war. It's not happening for the first time. We have already encountered the function of food as an instrument of punishment in the Holodomor of the 1932-1933 in Ukraine. And now when our prisoners of war are being released from Russian captivity and they weigh 30 kilograms less than they used to before the captivity, we understand that the use of hunger as a punishment is again on the table. So this story, can we call it a story, is being recycled in the Ukrainian history. And of course now we see that this cycle is not enclosed, it's opening up and it's soaking in the entire world, because the actions of Russia in Ukraine are targeted against not only Ukrainians, but also the countries of Africa and the Middle East, who will suffer because of the shortage of food production in Ukraine. So these are some of the things that unite us in our struggle now, and that have to be thought about more broadly, I think. And this intentional use of these leverages by Russia has to be stressed and highlighted, so that we stop talking about the Ukrainian grain problem and start talking about Russia's use of grain as an instrument of blackmail.
Yeah. The specificity of language is something that is so essential there. Before we kind of open up for questions here, I wanted to do something that I know happens over and over. You know, Ukrainians are asked to tell their own individual stories and their own individual stakes in this, and this is something that we all are burdening you with in many cases. But Sasha, I think you wrote just one of the most stunning pieces that I've read since the start of the full-scale invasion about your experience of kind of coming to terms with your own past and kind of rethinking it in the wake of this. And I wonder, you know, so coming from Zaporizhzhia, coming from this kind of land that we think of as this Cossack land, and yet kind of rejecting that to turn to a cosmopolitan Russophone world, and then rethinking that. How has the experience and reflection since the full-scale invasion changed your own understanding of yourself?
Yeah. Thank you for your kind words and for this question. So I was born in Zaporizhzhia, southeastern Ukraine, which is this Cossack land, the heartland of Ukrainian Cossackdom, where the proverbial heroes of Ukrainian history used to have their host, Zaporizhzhian Cossacks. And you would think that such a birthplace would lead to my at least acceptance or awareness of my Ukrainian heritage, which was not the case. I was brought up in a Russian-speaking family, and I was brought up in a Russian-speaking world, which was just infused with Russian culture and Russian cultural references. And I think it took a revolution for me to realize that my cosmopolitan worldview and my acceptance of St. Petersburg and Moscow as world cultural capitals, unlike Kiev, which was somewhat provincial, you know, it was a product of Russian imperial ideology, which I just absorbed. And it was only when Russia started using my first language as a weapon of war, when in 2014 Russia declared that it was about to liberate the Russian-speaking population of the south and of the east of Ukraine, which is basically me, by invading the south and the east of Ukraine, that I realized something was wrong with this narrative. And I started exploring Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian cultural tradition, cutting down my use of Russian sources to the point when I didn't speak the Russian language anymore and didn't engage in cultural dialogue, so to speak, with Russia. And it was a beneficial move for me because all the stories of Ukrainian resistance finally made sense. Finally, I realized that what was presented to me as the narratives of Ukrainian victimhood were actually the narratives of Ukrainian resistance from the 18th century to the 21st century. Everything that was presented to me in school and just in my social circles as, the never-ending cry and lament of Ukrainian people was actually a source of incredible power and knowledge, which I ignored, the knowledge about our oppressors. And I don't ignore it anymore, and my life has changed for better in that way.
I think we could all stand to do that, absolutely. So now we do have time for questions here. If you could raise your hand, and then please do introduce yourself. Since we're in the start of a new year here, there's lots of faces that I don't know yet, so please feel free. Please.
Krauchenberg, formerly from the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber, and I was in charge for Southeastern Europe. Actually, it's not really a question, but you mentioned the grain issue and its effect that, for instance, in African countries, also in Southeast Asia, Russia is trying hard to come up with the fake news that actually Ukraine is the one guilty, or the West, and isn't that so that the Western politicians are not making an issue out of it, because as a matter of fact is the Russian side destroying this, and that's the reason for the famine, and what could be done to have this narrative stronger, even in other areas beside politicians. Anyone should know better about it. What would you say to it? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that Ukraine does not bomb its own ports. Ukraine does not bomb its own agricultural infrastructure. Ukraine does not set its fields on fire, does not plant toxins in Ukrainian land, which is our sole source of wealth and perseverance. It's been done to the Ukrainian land, to the Ukrainian people, and by extension to the people of the world who rely on us to supply those means of feeding, their populations. I don't have an answer to your question how we should overcome this disinformation by Russia. Maybe we can brainstorm together. I can see Anna here, so who probably has an answer to this question, unlike me.
The wonderful news about the IWM is this week we get to hear fairy tales and policy analysis, so it's perfect. So join us again on Thursday evening.
Yes, but raising awareness in all audiences we have access to, using all platforms we have access to actually make it clear who is the culprit here, that it's not Ukraine, would be a good start.
Jan, please.
Well, Jan Farfal, Jerzy Giedroyć, visiting fellow. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. And my question relates to this myth-making mechanism that you related to, and some past experiences. You mentioned Sylvia Plath, but also Lesia Ukrainka. And I was wondering what kind of, whether you also analyze some methods using describing those tragic developments in previous instances of genocidal developments or massacres, such as, I don't know, Srebrenica, or even some cases from the past, whether this was also some sort of a case study where you tried to seek inspiration how to convey these tragic developments in a more powerful manner.
Thank you. I don't venture outside of the Ukrainian culture at the moment, just try to stay focused. If I had more time and scope, I would definitely do a comparative analysis. What I'm looking at, you mentioned the past tragedies. I'm obviously looking at the Holodomor now, and I'm writing stories about that and about the use of food and about Ukrainian spells that sort of feed us all and nourish us all. And are our weapon against the powers that seek to destroy us. One of the, not testimonies, one of the heroines I work with right now was killed last year in the Russian strike on Kremenchuk. She was in the shopping center that was bombed in June 2022. And she was a food writer. And she was a fantastic, flamboyant woman who collected recipes of Ukrainian regional cuisine, forgotten stories of Ukrainian food, which led her to discover forgotten histories of Ukrainian, of people who populated Ukraine for centuries. She became my guide into that area, into that new for me relationship to food. And in a way, she and her work was this force that reversed the relationship to food in Ukraine, which is sometimes defined by trauma of the Holodomor, sometimes defined by the trauma of the Soviet Union, when again food was turned into the vehicle of punishment. Her taste for life, taste for food, taste for history is, for me, another case of fantastic Ukrainian resistance. She's dead, but there are people who are now promoting her work. There are Ukrainian chefs who are cooking using her recipes in the best restaurants in Ukraine, but also the students of Ukrainian food culture who are like using her cookbook as their textbook. And I think by keeping her heritage alive, we already resist this power of annihilation, if it makes sense.
Absolutely. Okay.
I'm Ksenia Harchenko, the Documenting Ukraine project manager. And Sasha, thank you very much for this talk and for this reading. Kate, thank you very much. You've mentioned the fact that Ukrainian news, they're disappearing from the world's news rooms and the news feeds, but at the same time there is and the fading. And some people, they call it Ukraine fatigue, so that the world is tired of Ukraine. And at that same time, on the other kind of end of this war, Ukrainians are getting tired as well. They're getting kind of accustomed to the situation that has happened, to the circumstances that they found themselves in. They didn't actually choose it. And there are so many people who've been volunteering and working, and this whole adrenaline and this shock, that led people do all these incredible things at the beginning of this full-scale invasion. And now this exhaustion has come. And now when you have this kind of, not a space and not a distance, but at least you have these efforts of reflecting and of not even analyzing, but of making its way through your body and soul of these experiences that you have had encountered in other people and also in yourself. What is your source of power? If we can talk in the words of the General Zaluzhny and yes, and the Star Wars, which unfortunately are Earth words. Thank you.
Another wizard, yes. There are, and you know this as well as I do, there are people who can't afford to get tired because they will get wiped out. They will be erased. And probably they are my source of inspiration and they are my source of power. And I have access to platforms and to audiences they don't have access to. This means that I become their voice in a way. And as long as I can, I will be using this privilege to speak on their behalf. It's just the fact that so many Ukrainians can't afford to get fatigued and exhausted by this war that does not allow us to step back. Yeah.
Yeah, Hannah.
Thank you. Hanna Shelest, also from Ukraine, and currently, oh my God, fellow here. I will not be answering your question about the courts. I'm welcoming you on Thursday, but definitely one of the answers is about the bringing journalists to Ukraine, what Sasha have been doing. You just reminded us about Natalia Gumenyuk, who brought African journalists to Ukraine, and when they saw bombed ports and burnt fields, the stories became absolutely different. Small drop in the ocean, but only these drops are making the reality. I have another question, because you've been traveling around the region a lot. Do you feel the regional particularities of the resistance of people? Because there are so many talks about the regional differences, even within one region. So from Kyiv to the east, for example, going to the south, do we see the same patterns, or it is something that struck your attention?
Thank you so much, Anna. I think that we are in this unique moment in history when Ukrainians have met each other properly, probably for the first time, because East has been forced into the exile. People from Zaporizhia and Mariupol ended up in Lviv, maybe for the first time, and the Galicians were like seeing those mythologized Eastern Ukrainians for the first time, and actually could make up their minds about them, about the real people, and not myths fed to them by the propaganda. And it is this mosaic probably that is the most striking thing. During the first months of the full-scale invasion, I met so many Zaporizhians and people from Mariupol in Lviv. I probably did not expect to meet in my entire life. More than I was speaking to people from Lviv, I was speaking to people from Mariupol who were fleeing the city. Otherwise, patterns of resistance and their regional differences. I would say that Kharkiv is much more of a fortress city than, say, Lviv. Lviv is a place where Ukrainians probably can afford to just have some taste of life for a change, and have a nice coffee and relax a little bit. And Kharkiv is still in this collected mode. They're so close to the border. And I can tell you my own experience of leaving the Donetsk and Kharkiv regions. When we were driving towards Kyiv, I just felt in my body how the tension was leaving me. It's like, oh, I didn't realize I was so tense, because while you're there, you're constantly on the lookout. You look into the grass in order not to step on a landmine, and you listen to all the sounds, because you know that sometimes a missile hits before the air raid alarm is sounded. And once you move towards Kyiv, you realize in the unbearable conditions in which people actually live there, while putting up a brave face, like they do all over Ukraine.
Yeah, please.
Hi, Sasha. Thank you very much for your reading. My name is Sergei Kudelia. I'm a political science professor at Baylor in the United States. I'm finishing a book on the beginning of the war, not 2022, but on 2014. There is a lot in my book about resistance at that time in Donbass, but more of that book is on the other side of the coin, that is collaboration. There has been less collaboration of Ukrainians with the Russians in 2022 to 2023, but we still see a lot of it. We see a lot of it in occupied areas, recently occupied areas of Donbass. We certainly see that in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Just a couple of days ago, there were these staged elections. You don't call them elections, of course, but it's a ritual that Putin organized on the occupied areas. And we saw a lot of Ukrainians who served in the polling stations, who counted the ballots, who came to the polling booths, who announced the results. And in a way, by their presence, by their participation, they legitimized the process, and they allowed Putin and the Russian propaganda to show, well, these are the real Ukrainians that we liberated. I'm wondering, I understand the focus on resistance and the need to talk about Ukrainian resistance in the outside of Ukraine. But I'm wondering whether it's worth talking about collaboration as well, and if so, how should we talk about collaboration at this point? It's an incredibly sensitive topic. Austrians, from what I understand, are still having difficulty facing with their own history of collaboration during World War II, and that has been 50 years, more than 50 years since then. So what are your thoughts? Should we be open about this, acknowledge this, and find a way of conveying this problem and reflecting on this problem? Or should we just focus on one side, more heroic side for now, and wait until the end of the war to talk about collaboration then? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I probably have an answer. Let's imagine the situation when a gun has been put to your head. And in that situation, you are asked to, let's say, organize a local election and to sanctify its results with your presence. And you have a clear choice of either your brains being blown out or, you know, acting as a collaborator. I don't know what I would do in that situation, but I have a feeling that I would probably try to save my life. So this is the lens that the collaboration under the Russian occupation, I have this view of collaboration under the Russian occupation in the unbearable conditions that these people are living in right now. And also the Donbass, I'm sorry for being so picky with words, but the Donbass is actually something that describes the coal basin of the river Donetsk. And now we are trying to speak about this area as the Donetsk and Luhansk region in order not to, you know, just equate this territory with this lump of coal in the east of the country. Donetsk and Luhansk regions are not only defined by their coal economy, but many other diverse things. But yeah, collaboration, I think we had an example of this in the Ukrainian history already, recent history, when Russia invaded Crimea and conducted an election there and the referendum there. Under gunpoint, people voted for you know, for Russia. And I don't think that anyone can seriously consider these elections legitimate and so on.
Yeah, I think this is one of these interesting, you know, this is actually kind of reminding me in some ways of Jan, your question about the sort of other kind of myth-making cases. And I think it's another thing that we have a sort of, as the historian in me is going to say, there's sort of a body of literature on the nature of collaboration and how and what that actually can be kind of broken down into. And this is one of the things that we are trying to do as well, is to sort of push and say, what are the historical moments that we can think back to, right? How do we think, as you exactly say, with the Second World War and the sort of nature of collaboration and how we've kind of expanded our definition of what that is and sort of said maybe putting the label of collaborators is not actually, maybe we need a richer vocabulary to talk about it, and maybe that's something that can be developed in the Ukrainian case, right, is sort of exploding our terminology rather than kind of falling back on those terms. So that's one possibility there. But yeah, I saw you also had a question there.
Thank you for your personal insights. It's very interesting, especially to hear it from your perspective in your life. My name is Dietmar Pichler. I'm a disinformation analyst. I monitor Russian narratives and disinformation, especially in the Western, for Western audiences since 2014. And my question to you is, on a personal level, how do you deal with people who swallowed Russian narratives, if they are from the West or from other regions, if they confront it to you, because it's, as I heard from Ukrainians, especially painful, this victim blaming, false balance, both sidism?
Thank you for this question. Well, At this point, my response is to try to switch the conversation back to Ukraine. If we are again asked to reflect on Russia and to switch our attention to Russia, I sort of try to divert conversation back to Ukraine, to the thing that really matters right now. There are cases when this has been successfully done. In the coverage of, like, I'm sort of hanging by the thread, and I pick the examples which I really like. When Yevgeny Prigozhin was killed in Russia, it was also the day of remembrance of Ukrainian defenders who were taken away by the war, who were killed by Russia. And in the BBC News coverage, they sort of had to voice the news that Prigozhin was killed, but they almost apologized for it and said, like, but now we will focus on what is important today, and we will talk about the Remembrance Day for Ukrainian defenders. And they made a beautiful story about that. So I think this is a teachable moment, and we should always try to refocus on our attention when it is being diverted.
And that's also part of a bigger kind of historic pattern as well of always directing our focus towards the sort of great power, right? And sort of that's what we're trained to do, and that's what we're used to doing. And so sort of finding ways to disrupt that is something that continues to be an important thing to do. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So what I would suggest now is that we move our conversation. We can keep talking about this and more down in the IWM cafeteria in the basement over wine and cheese. Sasha, thank you so much for reading. Thank you for sharing your work with us and for this conversation.
It was an honor, and I just can't express enough how grateful I am to Kate and to Ksenia and to Masha and to IWM for allowing me this space to think and reflect on everything that has happened. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Do we really have wine?